In this video, we're going to finish the multiplying radical expressions worksheet on the KutaSoftware website under the Infinite Algebra 1 section. Now for numbers 21 through 28, we're going to be FOILing each of these terms. And what I mean by FOILing is because we're multiplying one binomial by another binomial, we need to multiply each of the terms to every term in that other binomial. So we're going to multiply the first terms together, so f, the first terms together. Then we're going to multiply the outside terms together. Then we're going to multiply the inside terms together. And then lastly, we'll multiply the last terms together. So let's get started in number 21. We're going to start by multiplying negative 2 times the square root of 3 by the square root of 3. That's negative 2 times the square root of 3 times 3. Since we'll multiply what's within the square roots together under the same square root. And then we'll add that to negative 2 times the square root of 3 times negative 5, since this 5 is subtracted. So negative 2 times the square root of 3 times negative 5, since that 5 is subtracted. That's the same as adding a negative. Then, after doing those outside terms, we'll do the inside terms. That's 2 times the square root of 3. So plus 2 times the square root of 3, and then finally the last terms, 2 times negative 5. So simplifying, we'll have negative 2 times the square root of 3 times 3, which is 3 squared, plus negative 2 times the square root of 3 times negative 5 is negative 2 times negative 5, which is a positive 10 times the square root of 3, and then I'm adding 2 times the square root of 3, and then I'm adding 2 times negative 5, which is negative 10. Now, I'm going to combine my like terms, which is 10 times the square root of 3 and 2 times the square root of 3, and I'm also going to pull out this 3 from the square root because the square root of 3 squared is 3. So I have negative 2 times 3 plus 10 plus 2 is 12, so that's 12 times the square root of 3, since 10 times the square root of 3 plus 2 times the square root of 3 is 12 times the square root of 3, and then as opposed to adding a negative 10, I'll subtract 10. So negative 2 times 3 is negative 6, and I'm adding that to 12 times the square root of 3 and then subtracting 10. So I can combine my negative 6 and negative 10, or subtract 10 from negative 6. So negative 6 minus 10 is negative 16, and that will get added to 12 times the square root of 3. So negative 16 plus 12 times the square root of 3 is my solution in number 21. In number 22, I'm FOILing again. So we're going to do first, then outside, inside, and then last. So 5 times negative 2, and I'll turn all my subtraction to adding a negative just to make it a little easier. So then I'll add 5 times the square root of 5, and then I'll add negative 4 times the square root of 5 times negative 2. Those are my inside terms. And then finally, my last terms, negative 4 times the square root of 5 times the square root of 5. So I'll be adding negative 4 times the square root of 5 times 5, since the square root of 5 times the square root of 5 is the square root of 5 times 5. So 5 times negative 2 is negative 10, and I'll add that to 5 times the square root of 5, and then add that to negative 4 times negative 2, which is a positive 8, times the square root of 5, and then negative 4 times the square root of 5 times 5, which is the square root of 5 squared. So I'll be able to pull out a 5 from that square root, and I'll be able to combine 5 times the square root of 5 with 8 times the square root of 5, since they have the same values within the square root. So I'll have negative 10 plus 13 times the square root of 5, since 5 plus 8 is 13, and then I'll add that to negative 4 times 5. So that's negative 10 plus 13 times the square root of 5 plus negative 20. Combining negative 10 with negative 20, I'll get negative 30 plus 13 times the square root of 5. That's my solution in number 22. Continuing on to number 23, again, I'm going to be FOILing. First, outside, inside, last. And just to make it easier on myself, I'm going to change this to adding negatives so that all my terms are added together, and then I'll decide when I need to subtract if I'm adding that negative. However, feel free to leave it. Just remember, your signs, whether you're adding or subtracting. Now, first is negative 2 times 5, and then I'll add that to the outside terms, which is negative 2 times negative square root of 5, and then my inside terms is negative 3 times the square root of 5 times positive 5, and then I'll add that to my last terms, which is negative 3 times the square root of 5 times negative square root of 5. So negative 2 times 5 is negative 10, and I'll add that to negative 2 times negative square root of 5, which negative square root of 5 is like negative 1 times the square root of 5, so that'll be a positive 2 times the square root of 5, plus negative 3 times 5 is negative 15, and then we're multiplying that by the square root of 5, and then I'll add that to negative 3 times negative 1, which is positive 3 times the square root of 5 times 5, because the square root of 5 times the square root of 5 is the square root of 5 times 5, which I'll go ahead and write as 5 squared. So now I'll pull out a 5, and I'll combine my like terms. So I'll have negative 10 plus 2 plus negative 15 is negative 13 times the square root of 5, and then I'll add that to 3 times 5, pulling out that 5 from the square root because the square root of 5 squared is 5. So I'll have negative 10 plus negative 13 times the square root of 5 plus 3 times 5, which is 15. So now, combining negative 10 and a positive 15, I'll get 5, and then as opposed to adding negative 13 times the square root of 5, I'll subtract positive 13 times the square root of 5. So that's 5 minus 13 times the square root of 5 for number 23. In number 24, when foiling, I'll multiply the square root of 5 by the square root of 5, the square root of 5 by the square root of 3, the square root of 3 by the square root of 5, and the square root of 3 by the square root of 3. And just to show you that you can keep subtraction within your problem, I'm not going to change this to adding the negative for this problem. So I have this first terms, square root of 5 times the square root of 5, which is the square root of 5 times 5. And then my next terms, my outside terms, the square root of 5 times the square root of 3 will be the square root of 5 times 3. And then my inside terms, since that square root of 3 is subtracted, I'll subtract the square root of 3 times the square root of 5, which is the square root of 3 times 5. And then my last terms, I'll also subtract the square root of 3 times the square root of 3, which is the square root of 3 times 3. Now the square root of 5 times 5 is the square root of 5 squared, plus the square root of 5 times 3 is the square root of 15, minus the square root of 3 times 5 is the square root of 15, minus the square root of 3 times 3 is the square root of 3 squared. So what I'll be doing is pulling out a 3 and pulling out a 5 and combining my like terms. So I'll have the square root of 5 squared, which is 5, plus the square root of 15 minus the square root of 15 is 0, and then I'll be subtracting the square root of 3 squared, which is 3. 5 plus 0 minus 3 is a positive 2. So 2 is my solution in number 24. In number 25, multiplying my first two terms together, I'll have 5 times negative 4, which is negative 20, and then I'll multiply that by 2x times 2x, and then I'll add that to my outside terms, 5 times the square root of 2x times the square root of 5x, which is 5 times the square root of 2x times 5x, and then I'll add that to my inside terms, which is the square root of 5 times negative 4 times the square root of 2x, which is negative 4 times the square root of 5 times 2x, and then I'll add that to my last terms, the square root of 5 times the square root of 5x. So that's the square root of 5 times 5x. So simplifying, I'll have negative 20 times the square root of 2x squared plus 5 times the square root of 10x squared plus negative 4 times the square root of 10x plus the square root of 5 squared times x. So now I'll be able to pull out 2x, since that quantity is squared within the square root. I'll be able to pull out an x, and I'll be able to pull out a 5. So I'll have negative 20 times 2x plus 5x times the square root of 10 plus negative 4 times the square root of 10x plus 5 times the square root of x. Now simplifying, I'll multiply negative 20 to 2x, which is negative 40x, and I'll add that to 5x times the square root of 10, and then I'll be subtracting 4 times the square root of 10x, since adding a negative is the same as subtracting a positive, and then I'll add that to 5 times the square root of x. None of those other terms can be combined, so this is my simplified expression in number 25. Negative 40x plus 5x times the square root of 10 minus 4 times the square root of 10x plus 5 times the square root of x. And number 26, foiling again, my first two terms, negative 3 times the square root of 3k times the square root of 3k. So negative 3 times the square root of 3k times 3k. And I'll be adding that to my outside terms, negative 3 times the square root of 3k times negative 5, because that 5 is subtracted. So that'll be negative 3 times the square root of 3k times negative 5. And then I'll add that to the multiplication of my inside terms, 4 times the square root of 3k. And then I'll add that to my last terms multiplied together, 4 times negative 5. So I'll have negative 3 times the square root of 3k squared plus negative 3 times negative 5 is positive 15 times the square root of 3k, and then I'll add that to 4 times the square root of 3k, and then add 4 times negative 5, which is a negative 20. Combining my like terms, and I'm also going to pull out a 3k because the square root of 3k squared is 3k. So I'll have negative 3 times 3k plus 15 plus 4 is 19 times the square root of 3k, since 15 and 4 were both multiplied by the square root of 3k. And then, as opposed to adding negative 20, I'll subtract a positive 20. So lastly, I'll multiply negative 3 and 3. So I'll have negative 9 times k plus 19 times the square root of 3k, and then I'll be subtracting 20. Negative 9k plus 19 times the square root of 3k minus 20. And number 27, 5 will get multiplied to 3, and then added to 5 times the square root of 3, then added to 4 times the square root of 3 times 3, and then 4 times the square root of 3 times the square root of 3. So 5 times 3 plus 5 times the square root of 3 plus 4 times the square root of 3 times 3 plus 4 times the square root of 3 times the square root of 3, which is 4 times the square root of 3 times 3. 5 times 3 is 15, and I'll add that to 5 times the square root of 3 plus 4 times 3 is 12, and that gets multiplied by the square root of 3, and then I'll add 4 times the square root of 3 times 3, which is 4 times the square root of 3 squared. So I'll be able to pull out a 3, and I'll also be able to combine like terms. So I'll have 15 plus 5 plus 12 is 17 times the square root of 3, since both 5 and 12 were multiplied by the square root of 3, and then I'll add that to 4 times 3. So 15 plus 17 times the square root of 3 plus 4 times 3, which is 12. 15 plus 12 is 27. So I'll have 27 plus 17 times the square root of 3 as my solution for number 27 on this worksheet. 27 plus 17 times the square root of 3. Now lastly, number 28. Again, I'm foiling. 3 times the square root of 2 times the square root of 2. And then my outside terms, 3 times the square root of 2 times 3 times the square root of 5r, remembering that that's subtracted. Then my inside terms, the square root of 5 times the square root of 2. And then my last terms, the square root of 5 times 3 times the square root of 5r. So 3 times the square root of 2 times the square root of 2 is 3 times the square root of 2 times 2. And I'll add that to 3 times the square root of 2 times negative 3 times the square root of 5r. And then I'll add the square root of 5 times the square root of 2, which is the square root of 5 times 2. And then I'll add the square root of 5 times negative 3 times the square root of 5r, which is negative 3 times the square root of 5r times 5, because 5r and 5 are within that radical, so they'll be multiplied together under that square root. So I'll have 3 times the square root of 2 squared plus 3 times negative 3 is negative 9 times the square root of 2 times 5r plus the square root of 5 times 2, which is the square root of 10, plus negative 3 times the square root of 5 squared times r. So what I did is I multiplied what was in those radicals, and then outside those radicals, 3 times negative 3, which was negative 9, multiplied 5 times 2 within that radical, and then multiplied 5 by 5 to get 5 squared. So I'll be able to pull out a 2, and I'll be able to pull out a 5. So I'll have 3 times 2 plus negative 9 times the square root of 10r plus the square root of 10 plus negative 3 times 5 times the square root of r, pulling out that 5. 3 times 2 is 6, so that's 6, and then I'll be subtracting 9 times the square root of 10r, since adding a negative is the same as subtracting a positive, so minus 9 times the square root of 10r, and then I'll add the square root of 10, and then I'll add negative 3 times 5, which is negative 15 times the square root of r, but if we're adding a negative, that's the same as subtracting a positive, so I'll subtract positive 15 times the square root of r. So 6 minus 9 times the square root of 10r plus the square root of 10 minus 15 times the square root of r. That's my final solution on this worksheet. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. And if you didn't do so already, remember to like this video and subscribe to my channel. All likes and subscriptions are greatly appreciated. And while you're at it, feel free to share this video. That also shows me your support.